Indian Member of Parliament and senior leader of the Indian National Congress Party, Dr. Shashi Tharoor recently addressed the global Indian diaspora and members of the Indian Overseas Congress on COVID-19 impact and India's response. India has more than 70,000 cases with strict stay-at-home orders extended beyond May 17th, impacting lives of many living in India. Dr. Shashi Tharoor commented on the agenda of the Modi Bharatiya Janata Party government during the COVID-19 response, providing an alarming take on Indian economy, the migrant worker conditions in India, as well as the healthcare crisis. He said that the Congress Party has been urging the central Indian government to provide adequate relief to the ones suffering in India, especially the marginalized communities, focused on providing food and shelter. Dr. Shashi Tharoor also answered questions on Indian students studying outside of India, as well as gave his message for all of the Indians living abroad.
You can just talk about the New World Disorder in 2 minutes. It's simply to say that I have written a book on the subject, which was released in January, and it talks about the way in which the system that was set up at the end of the Second World War, yesterday, in fact, is the 75th anniversary of the surrender in Europe in 1945. And in the course of these 75 years, an international order was set up, which is now fraying at the edges before the COVID crisis, thanks to very many countries having turned in the direction of more hyper-nationalism, more ethnocentrism, more xenophobia, and more protectionism. We can talk about that separately, but that's been a global current many of you have seen. And the question that is in some people's minds is with the COVID crisis and people being anxious to point fingers at others. We're seeing, for example, Mr. Trump taking the opportunity not just to criticize China, but even, as you know, to attack the World Health Organization. And the real question that comes up then is, how do we actually manage to run a world system in which more and more countries are retreating behind their nationalist sovereign barriers? I hope that India will be a constructive voice for more international cooperation, not less. That has been our instinct throughout, and my hope would be that we will indeed approach it in that spirit in the time to come. But answering what Sam G started us off with, on the situation in the country. We have now been under lockdown since the 24th of March, which is certainly less time than Sam has been under lockdown, and some of you in America have been locked down for longer. But in India, it has been recorded and described around the world as the most stringent lockdown on the globe. We did see a lot of reaction. The biggest complaints that we had, and I'm going to try and keep it brief because I think your questions are the main purpose of this exchange. But let me say, if I were to speak personally and as a Congress MP, I would say that one concern I would have had from the very start is that the lockdown came initially a bit late. I had been calling for one on social media at least 10 to 12 days before it happened. Rahul Gandhi had said in early February, on the 12th of February, that the government was not taking COVID seriously enough. The government at that point was focused on the avoidable distraction of the Trump visit at the end of February, and subsequently on the other distraction of bringing down the Congress government in Madhya Pradesh, which happened on the 23rd of March. So they wanted to convey an illusion of normality until then, including keeping Parliament going, so they were not under any pressure to shut down the Madhya Pradesh legislature. The result was that the country was locked down later than it should have been, number one. Number two, it was locked down at ridiculously short notice. The Prime Minister gave the people of India 48 hours notice to just have a Sunday curfew, a Janta curfew on a Sunday. But then he gave the nation on the next Monday, he gave them 4 hours notice to lock down for 21 days. And the problem with that is so little notice means people couldn't make any arrangements. Employers couldn't make arrangements for their employees. Factories couldn't make arrangements for their workers. And migrant workers who needed to go home because they no longer had a job or a daily wage or a roof over their heads, they had no means of transport because all trains, planes, buses, interstate travel were shut down, highways were closed.
My question is concerning Indian international students in Canada and across the world. Canada itself has over 200,000 students from India and more who have graduated in recent past. It's fairly safe to say that most of these students are financially supported by student loans from India. Is there already or will there be any provisions for an interest-free deferral of loan payments during this COVID-impacted time period?
Excellent question. Thank you. And we have, in fact, recommended that. We believe that, first of all, loan repayments need to be deferred, not only for students, I might add, but also for small businesses and others, including people who've just taken home loans, car loans. Ideally, the loan repayment should be deferred for about 3 months or as long as the virus emergency lasts. But then if at the end of the 3 months, everybody has to pay accumulated interest, that's going to be a bigger blow than if they pay what they can right now. So we have asked for the interest to be waived. I think that's a loss the government should be able to subsidize with the banks. The government should be able to bear this. Every government has more resources than they like to admit. In India, for example, they have raised the excise duty on petrol to a staggering 13 rupees per litre. In other words, now when you go to the petrol pump, the gas station, as you would say in North America, something like 67% of what you're paying is just excise duties to the government of India. Now, where is all that money going? It should be used to do things like this. Protect our students, protect our businesses, give some support to wage earners, buffer them so they can then come back and be economically active as soon as the emergency is over. So, Mohammed Roshan, I'm with you on this suggestion, and we will continue advocating it.
Reverse inflow of urban immigrants will cause much social pressure in our rural areas with regard to employment and life-sustaining activities. How can the social engineering coupled with the social banking give a new life to the suffering teeming millions in our rural areas, especially that of Congress-run states? Thank you.
Good question, and a very tough one to answer, because some of the reverse migration you're talking about is of people who left in the first place for the urban areas because they could find no work in the rural areas. And these are people who are working in daily wage professions, rickshawalas, chai sellers, domestic helpers, factory hands, and so on. Obviously, you can do those professions in cities or where there are large numbers of people, but you're not going to make a viable living trying to do those things back home in the villages. The only answer, as I said at the very beginning of this Q&A, was to follow Dr. Abdul Kalam's advice and increase the provision of urban facilities in rural areas through extensive building up of rural infrastructure. Electrification is one thing, but also dramatic expansion of broadband, so that a lot of jobs that could be done virtually don't need to be done in congested cities and can be done in rural areas. As for banking, I'm not sure I fully understand the term. The Congress has recommended the sort of Nyai scheme, which will ensure that there is a basic minimum wage, a basic income given to the poor, so they can start generating their own lives without worrying about whether they can afford to eat today or sleep under their home roof. That kind of subvention is the only answer to deal with this in the rural areas.